After 12 o'clock here Central Time. So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to day two of our virtual conversation series. I'm super excited to be here with you all today and engage in a conversation with our friend Chelsea. And so, as we get started, I just want to do a couple of housekeeping things and really welcome everybody. My name's Kristen Young. I use she, her pronouns, and I serve as the executive director here at Leadership. And I'll be with you all today, just engaging in the dialogue with Chelsea as well and learning along with you all as we have this conversation. So I'm super excited to be here. While we're getting settled and while people are still coming into the Zoom room, please use the chat feature to go ahead and introduce yourselves. We want this to be as interactive and engaging as possible. And so if you feel comfortable, please introduce yourself by sharing your name, your pronouns if you'd like, and where you're joining us from today. I'm joining you from dark and gloomy Champaign, Illinois, the Midwest that has not seen sun in a really long time. So maybe some of you can relate to that. But so happy to have you all. So just go ahead and drop that there in the chat as we get started. And while you do that, I want to just center ourselves for a little while in just a moment in this land acknowledgement. For this land acknowledgement, I think everybody's still there. It told me I was logged in from another device, but I'm not. I'm right here. So our land acknowledgement today, just by thinking about where each of us is at today in the original homelands of the indigenous and tribal nations, and we do acknowledge that painful history and the genocide and forced removal from the territories, and we honor and respect that many indigenous and diverse peoples that are connected to the lands that each of us sit on, wherever we are. So we ask you to just take a moment to honor and acknowledge the Native and Indigenous peoples from the lands where you are joining us from today, and give some thought to your own ancestries and the generations of people who have come before you to make it possible for you to be in this space today. With that, as we get started, a little bit about Leadership. If Leadership is new to you, welcome. We're so glad to be in this space with you. We are a not-for-profit whose mission is to transform the world by increasing the number of people who lead with integrity and a healthy disregard for the impossible. We believe when we do that work and we do the work of our mission, that we are working to create a more just, caring, and thriving world. And so part of our conversation series, it revolves around that. It is about us all being teachers and learners in the space and working collectively to create that type of environment. So now I would like to bring Chelsea on and let you do your introduction, Chelsea, and get started with our conversation today.
Awesome. Thank you, Kristen. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining today. Let me just make sure my slides are showing up okay, and then we can jump in. Okay. Everybody can see those okay? Okay, amazing. So again, my name is Chelsea. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm super excited to talk with you all today about something that I care a lot about. And I was just saying to Kristen, has sort of been my life's work as I think back on my career in scholarship. So we'll be talking about supervision, well-being in the context of student affairs and leadership education. We will be kind of beginning our time today talking a little bit about supervision, and then we'll change gears and talk a little bit about well-being, and then how those two things connect. And then we'll wrap up by talking about some tips and strategies for supervisory practices that foster well-being. And I will first spend a little bit of time telling you all about myself and kind of sharing my own entry point to this conversation. So I worked in student affairs and higher education roles for about 8 years before I transitioned in 2020 to a full-time PhD program at Ohio State. And I focused my work on educator trauma and supervision. I've been lucky to be a part of the leadership community as a co-lead since 2016. And in that time, I've met so many amazing leadership educators, some of whom have joined here today. People who are fellow co-leads, program coordinators, on-site coordinators, cluster facilitators. And it's been the conversations that I've gotten to have with all of you that have really inspired me to bring this topic to Leadership Series today. And you all have answered some of these questions already. I am curious in hearing more about you. Many of you have already shared your name and pronouns and where you're joining us from, but I'd also love to know specifically what brought you here today. It can just be like a quick sentence. So if you've already answered the questions, you don't have to share that again. But yeah, I'm just curious why you're here. What was it that made you curious enough to register or click on the Zoom link? I'll give everybody a sec just to reflect on that and share. Thanks, Mike. So looking for some exposure to like-minded people, some connection and community. Thinking about well-being of student leaders. Thanks, Stephanie. Scott, thinking about promoting well-being in the field. It takes so much from us and often doesn't get us filled back up. Juan, looking for more information about that misalignment that sometimes comes up between espoused and enacted values with supervision. Yeah, and feel free to react and comment on each other's posts, absolutely. Give it one other second. How to be a better supervisor, ensure people's well-being. Thanks, Andy. Awesome. Well, feel free if you're still pondering, if you want to let me know what brought you here, that's great for me. I really want this to be relevant and impactful. And most of what I'll be going over today will be most relevant for those of you who are currently supervising others in higher education, including those of you who are supervising leadership educators. But I hope whoever you are and whatever brought you here, you'll find something meaningful. And I will have opportunities for you to kind of engage and chime in throughout, but I also encourage you at any point, just use the chat or the raise hand function. I'm happy for you to share questions, comments, or thoughts at any point throughout our conversation today. So I'm just scooting all my windows around so I can still see the chat and see all of you. Let's begin by talking about supervision. And I'd love to get a sense of your entry point into the conversation too. So if your version of Zoom has the reaction feature, go ahead and just pick an emoji that broadly represents your experience with supervisors to this point. And if your version of Zoom doesn't have that feature, you can put it in the chat. If you don't know how to put an emoji in the chat, you could just put a word. That's fine too. But just curious broadly, what's been your experience with supervisors? Thanks, Juan. Sort of exasperated, yet exhausted, sad face is how I interpret that one. I see a frustrated face, and the upside down smiley, my personal favorite, a cringe face, a scream face, a wondering face. Okay, so there's sort of a range here, but I'm sensing kind of a theme of some of our experiences perhaps with supervisors have not been the best ones. And you all are in very good company. Although there are some more positive ones. I see Leah's got smiley face. Abby's got sort of a transition of supervisory experiences throughout the field. Thank you all for sharing. So I want to share a little bit about my entry point as well into this conversation and kind of what got me started and being interested in this topic. So I was about a year into my first professional role in higher education, and I attended a conference, and a specific gathering at the conference was for new professionals. And so I was in the room with about 20 other people. We all did our introductions and we're supposed to share something we wanted to talk about. And I was pretty shocked that nearly every comment had a common theme of supervision. People had a lot to say about the topic. By the time we were done with our introductions, we only had about 10 minutes left in the hour-long gathering. So this moment stuck with me for so many years and became especially salient for me as I came to supervise my own team eventually. And I was seeking out supervision resources and tried to find whatever research I could that would help me to become a better supervisor. But unfortunately, what I found is that supervision resources in higher education are pretty sparse, and research on supervision in higher education, likewise, very sparse. And this has stayed pretty consistent over the last decade. And last I checked, I could not find any research specifically on leadership educators' experience with supervision. The research that does exist tells us a few things. First, supervisors in higher education typically receive no training on how to supervise. And maybe this resonates with your own experiences. What I find tends to happen is you do a great job in a role, and then it's assumed you'll naturally do a great job supervising someone in that role. Supervision is sort of assumed to be natural or innate rather than a skill to be cultivated. And that lack of training has some consequences. Some research has shown that most professionals in higher education are dissatisfied broadly with the quality of their supervision. Again, isn't much of a surprise to those of you who had the ambiguous or horrified faces in your reactions. But even more interesting, I think, is research that says when rating themselves, supervisors tend to overestimate their effectiveness. So, in other words, supervisors rated themselves more highly on almost every element of their supervisory practices than how their teams rated them. And poor supervision has real consequences. Big picture, it's correlated with things like higher turnover and lower job satisfaction, which have only been exacerbated in recent years with the Great Recession. And on a more individual level, having an ineffective supervisor can have some pretty disastrous consequences for supervisees' well-being. We'll talk about well-being next. Again, I'm curious to hear from you all, and this time you can just put it in the chat. But what comes up for you as you think about well-being at work? Like, what are some things that come to mind? So I'll just let you think about that for a sec and maybe put a couple of your thoughts in the chat about what you associate with workplace well-being.
Thanks, Chelsea, for that question. I think it's interesting. I didn't type mine in there, but while people are typing, I think it's interesting because I think it's not something we talk about very often, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah, it could
where
be hard.
it's mentioned maybe in passing, like, oh, that would be a good thing for you to do, but then we also don't spend the time to do anything about it.
Sure. Yeah, and work-life balance is a common one that I hear come up. So I've seen a couple people talk
Mhm.
about that one. Anna's got a cool perspective, I think, of being flexible and defining it for yourself. Wellness might look different for everyone. Could be about stress, trust, boundaries, job expectations. Yeah, a lot of great nuanced perspectives there. Awesome. Thank you all for sharing. So, as I progressed in my career in higher education, I definitely noticed that my work started to have a big impact on my well being. I started to feel exhausted and burned out. And that had impacts on things like my creativity, my problem solving, how I could show up for students. And the institutions where I worked often had wellness initiatives, which probably sound familiar for you all. They were things like free massages or get a Fitbit or go to this workshop on self care. And yeah, I think many institutions have things like these. But what I found is that those things didn't seem to make a difference for me or for my friends or colleagues when we had to do things like work second jobs just to afford our cost of living, or when we stayed late in the evening for student programs and then had to show up early for work the next day. And I think Juan said this at the beginning. For me, it felt like a huge disconnect between what the institution said, which was like, we value employee well being, and then what actually was happening. So again, I turned to research on workplace well-being. And similar to the research on supervision, this research is also pretty rare in higher education settings. Again, I looked and I couldn't find anything specifically on leadership educator well-being. However, some research has established the reality that we all probably know to be true. Working in higher education demands a lot emotionally from us. And I think Scott brought this up earlier as well. In addition to long hours we work, working with students is fundamentally care work. And most of us do it because we love it, but it's not always sustainable. And the demands of our work and the emotional impact of our work can actually be experienced as trauma for some. Now, typically we think about trauma as something that comes up after we experience a one-time disturbing event, something like a natural disaster or an act of violence. And definitely those things can result in something called post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. That is often associated with sleeplessness, hypervigilance, and numbness. But PTSD symptoms can also occur for people who regularly work with others who experience trauma. There was a study on people who work in residence life that demonstrated that responding to crisis calls resulted in something called secondary or vicarious trauma with very similar symptoms in terms of PTSD. And connected with that, numbers of college students who have experienced trauma are growing. That leads to more demands on those of us who are supporting students. And then beyond this, experiencing oppression from things like racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, and other problematic systems can also have a traumatic impact. Scholars have referred to this as collective or systemic trauma, and it represents the toll that living in a racist, sexist, ableist, homophobic, or transphobic world takes on our bodies, our minds, and our spirits. And there's some research that indicates that student affairs staff who hold one or more minoritized identities experience some unique trauma when supporting students who also hold that minoritized identity. Some scholars have called this vicarious racism. So, just to recap, because it was a lot of information. Holistic well-being on a number of levels is a concern for student affairs staff, including leadership educators. But how is this actually connected to supervision? So I've spent the last 6 years looking into this question, which is not often talked about in my experience in higher education settings. And the most significant work in this area has actually been done in the realm of clinical mental health. So researchers in counseling and social work have established a few things that I think are very relevant to us in higher education context. The first is that supervisors really have a lot of power in setting the tone for their supervisees when it comes to an environment that either fosters or erodes well-being. And some studies shown that poor supervision in a clinical mental health context actually worsens trauma-related outcomes for staff. And in some cases, supervisors actually perpetuate trauma for their supervisees. On the other hand, though, effective supervision can be incredibly powerful. It can reduce the impact of trauma, increase well-being, and improve the quality of life of supervisees. And therapists who rated their supervisors as effective have reported feeling more confident and competent in their roles, were less likely to experience burnout, and were more likely to actually stay in those roles. So supervisors are incredibly important for staff well-being. So to recap, we've established that supervisors are incredibly important to fostering well-being, and that's for all student affairs staff, especially leadership educators. But what does that actually look like in practice? In my own ongoing quest to be a better supervisor, I often thought about this question, and I ended up grounding my own supervisory practice in two principles from clinical mental health: trauma-informed supervision and identity-conscious supervision. So some of you might be familiar with the principles of trauma-informed practices. There's 5 of them: safety, trust, agency, empowerment, and collaboration. And these 5 principles are used in trauma-informed supervision, similar to how they're used in other types of trauma-informed practice. And essentially, it means if we're trying to be trauma-informed supervisors, that we enter into relationships with the assumption that traumatization might be in our presence at any moment. And then we act with intentionality and care to prioritize supervisees' voice and choice while building a collaborative and empowering relationship. So I'm curious, going back to your little emojis, you all had supervisors who practiced these principles. Maybe if they did something that felt especially impactful. Or on the flip side, maybe some of us have had supervisors who did not practice these principles, who did not establish safety or trust, who were not empowering or collaborative. I'm curious, what was the impact of that? So again, I'll give you a moment to think. If you'd like to put it in the chat, that's great. Or if you want to unmute and share with the rest of us, you're welcome to do that too. I'm just curious about your own experiences with these things. Thanks, Tiffany. So it sounds like you maybe had an experience with broken confidentiality, which had a big impact on trust. Looks like others are resonating with that one too.
I think often, Chelsea, for me, it's come down to then a lack of self-confidence or belief in myself when I've had a supervisor who doesn't exhibit these beliefs or practice or doesn't practice them, right? Is that then I take that very personally as it's something that I was not doing correctly and I'm not capable.
Yeah, going back to that research that when supervisors are trauma informed, it improves staff members' confidence. It definitely goes the other way, right? If you're not in a supervisory environment that's safe, trusting, collaborative, empowering, of course, your confidence is going to go down, which is going to have direct impacts on your work with students as well.
Absolutely, right? Because then you approach it with a I was approached it probably not as eager or as wanting to be involved because I didn't think I had the skill to be in that space.
Sure. Yeah, and Diana, thanks for sharing your experience, and I'm sorry that happened to you, that a supervisor humiliated you publicly. So that's an instance where supervisors can actually perpetuate trauma, right, by their actions or inactions. Sounds like Elizabeth, maybe you've had someone who did practice these things, they valued your experience and expertise. And some of our friends who are all joining together at USF experienced some management by fear or reactive practice on top of some, sounds like, unrealistic workplace expectations of being on call at all hours, which had certainly an impact. Yeah, thank you all for sharing. So trauma-informed supervision is one set of practices I've tried to implement in my own work. The other is identity conscious supervision. Um, because trauma does not exist in a vacuum, neither does supervision, right? Our supervisory relationships and our experiences with trauma are inevitably impacted by our identities and corresponding positionalities in our experiences with the world. And identity conscious supervision means having an awareness of and attention to power supervisory relationships. I've heard, I think, some really well-intentioned supervisors say, I share power with my supervisees. We're all on an equal playing field. There's no hierarchy. And even though those come from well-intentioned places, supervision, the reality is it's inherently hierarchical. That's something we just can't escape in institutions of higher education that are inevitably set up with those hierarchies. But being aware of those power dynamics and working to address them is something that identity conscious supervisors can and should do. Identity conscious is also internal. It requires intentional reflexivity, considering our own identities and experiences and how these might relate to assumptions we make or views that we have about the world. And that's an ongoing practice, not just something we can do one time or in one training. And finally, identity consciousness requires a lot of individualization. Not every person is going to want to engage with their supervisor deeply about the nuances of their identities. For some, it takes a lot of time before enough trust is built to have those vulnerable conversations. And each of these concepts are kind of interrelated with the 5 principles of trauma-informed supervision that we discussed just now. They feed into and reinforce one another. In my own practice, I can't imagine being trauma-informed without also being identity conscious. Similarly, I'm curious from y'all's perspective, in general, how has identity shown up in your supervisory relationships? And then maybe considering your own multiple identities, what do you hope for in a supervisor? What do you look for there? And I'll give you some time to think through it. And again, if you'd like to put it in the chat, that's great. Or if you'd like to unmute, I'm curious to hear your perspectives too.
It's interesting. I think over time, Chelsea, as you're talking and thinking and you're sharing these things, I always think about the multiple supervisors I've had and how our identities have been different and how different parts of my identity show up differently given what identities they share, whether we have them in common or whether we do not, and how the power then dynamic that that we might share or might be in conflict with each other then plays in those relationships and how different each one has been over time.
Yeah, and going back to individualization too, those of us who supervise more than one person might have very different relationships, right? Or very different dynamics with different people on our team, based on personality, shared experience, or also identity and positionality. Yeah, absolutely. If folks don't have experiences that come to mind or don't want to share, maybe think about that second question, like what would you hope for in a supervisor who was considering your identities? And for some of us, we maybe never experienced what we hoped for.
Right.
Oh yeah, Andy's talking about generational differences in supervision. That's an important point too, another aspect of identity that can play a role. And age as well was sort of a salient theme for one. Yeah, thank you for that. That's an important one. Anna hopes for someone who advocates for their staff. That's a positive example, leads by example. Absolutely. Flexibility for how identities change over time. Yeah, definitely. So being a new mom or having other life changes, right, that we go through and how that's impacting how we show up at work. Awesome. Thank you all. So I want to transition into talking through some tips and strategies. Um, with all of these, I'm going to also pause because I imagine there's a lot of great wisdom and experience in the room too. So I'm going to pause and see if you all have any additional tips or strategies that you want to share with one another. And then I'll share some pieces from my own experience too. So the first is that self-exploration and education is really the foundation of trauma-informed and identity-conscious supervision. So some of this means educating yourself about the realities of trauma at work and how it might play out for folks who are leadership educators or who work in student affairs. And some of it might be educating yourself about supervision. Again, most of us go into supervisory roles without any of that training. And those of us who have been lucky enough to have it typically did not get training that's trauma informed or identity conscious, in my experience. So before we end, I have a couple of book recommendations that are great starting points that I'll share. I'll also have a form at the end that you can fill out if you want additional resources. I'm happy to share those with you. But another important element of self-exploration and ongoing education can take place through receiving feedback. 360 feedback is one of my favorite models. So if you're unfamiliar with that, that basically just means typically in like a performance review process in higher education, feedback flows in one direction, kind of top down, right? Our supervisors say once a year or whatever, here's how I think you're doing, how many stars you get out of 5, or however institutions do that. And it's just the only feedback that we receive, and it's an incomplete picture because we're working with lots and lots of other people, including our teams, who probably have feedback for us. So one thing that I did at my prior institution is my team and I actually created a 360 feedback tool because there wasn't one at the time at my institution. It was very simple. It was a Google form, but we twice a year, professional staff, grad students, and undergraduate student staff all did this 360 feedback activity where we got feedback from our supervisors, but also from our supervisees and our peers and our other stakeholders that we worked with. As a way, in this ongoing way, to sort of learn more about how we're showing up, what impact we're having on other people. And I remember for me, early on when I started doing that, I received some feedback that was really transformative. So I worked in a campus LGBT center, like many offices in student affairs. We had a lot of evening and weekend things that we would do with students. And I would tell my team, hey, you just worked that late event, take a half day tomorrow, or you were here all day Saturday for an orientation thing, pick a day and take it as comp time. I'd say that all the time. But then I would not do those things. Like I would definitely be that person who would work late and then come in the morning, and I would not keep track of the comp time I had or just would not bother to take it off. Like that was a common thing that I would do. And what I heard in our 360 feedback process is that that communicated an important message to my team, right? That told them, all right, you say one thing, you don't actually do that. What you do actually makes us feel like you expect us to do the same thing, right? Which was absolutely not my intent. So through that 360 feedback process, I think that I became a much better supervisor because I was able to say, all right, what I do actually matters in some ways even more than what I say. And I need to take that to heart. So that was just a part of my own ongoing exploration and education. So I'm curious from you all, are there any other strategies you would recommend in terms of self-exploration and education as a supervisor? Maybe there are resources you found that are helpful or other practices that you do that enabled you to do some of that deeper work yourself.
I found sometimes even just having conversations with other supervisors, the other people who are supervising, like to have a group of people that you can talk to, that you can share, struggles with or successes with, and just get that like perspective of people who are also supervising folks, whether it's at your institution or even somewhere else, like somewhere. It's been nice for me if it's been somewhere completely removed from where I am, so that they also can give me some, hopefully, really honest thoughts and opinions when I bring them something and not be connected to the institution that I'm a part of.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. I know I'm a LGBTQ person myself, and the concept of chosen family has been really important to me, like making connections with people outside of the family network I grew up with, and choosing those folks. And I found I haven't had great supervision experiences in higher ed, but I've created a chosen supervisory network in a
Yeah.
sense, right? People who are peers or mentors or former supervisees, right? It's all kinds of people who I think really enriched my own practice through having these ongoing connections with them. And that model is actually quite common in clinical mental health. So those of
Mm.
you who are therapists or have friends who are therapists, often when they talk about supervision, it's something that's happening in a group, right? Where there's that peer support that's happening in addition to kind of some mentorship. And it's a model that works super well in that setting. It's a great point. Okay. So another piece of some tips and strategies that I will share have to do with having structured check-ins with each of your team members. And this, I think, sometimes can be really challenging when they're just never enough hours in the day to do our work in higher ed or in leadership education. And Stephen Quay and colleagues, when they wrote the Strategic Imperative for Racial Justice and Decolonization for ACPA, talked about the need to suspend efficiency and give time to relationship building. So I think about that a lot in the context of supervision, that it might be tempting, in our one-on-ones with our team to just kind of run through a list of tasks that are going on or programs that are coming up. And that's not going to, however well-intentioned you are, right, however kind you are to your staff, that's not actually going to provide a strong foundation for relationship building at all. In a 1 hour one-on-one, I think at least 10, 15, 20 minutes, most times have to be spent on some of that relationship building piece. And some of it also means discussing the emotional impact of the work and of the world that we live in. So I'm currently wrapping up my dissertation. And in this dissertation, I've been working with a group of women of color who worked or currently work in student affairs. And many of them were the only or one of very few people of color in their department. And they told me over and over about going to student affairs divisional meetings or team meetings right after something really traumatic happened in the world, right? Like um, instance of police violence or a high profile incident of anti-Asian violence. And time again, they found, and I've experienced this as well, nobody would even say anything or acknowledge what happened, right? It is really important, I think, for us as supervisors to be aware of what's going on in the world and to open up space to say, this is impacting all of us. Now, folks may or may not decide they want to talk about those things, but at least acknowledging it is really critical. And it goes to the third point, which is having proactive conversations about identity and power, especially if we as supervisors do not hold a heritage identity that our team holds. It's really on us to open up again space for those conversations and realize and acknowledge that it takes some time and some intentionality to build up trust to be able to have that space. But again, suspending that efficiency to have those structured check-ins where there's time and space to talk about identity, power, what's going on in the world, how it's impacting our staff is really critical. So I'm curious, again, and I'll read some of the comments in the chat. Are there any other things that have helped you all when you have structured check-ins with your team, or things that supervisors have done for you that you found to be really meaningful in terms of taking trauma-informed or identity-conscious approach? It looks like for Laura from, I'm losing an earbud. Here we go. For Laura from USF, sometimes those have been kind of challenging conversations with supervisees, and taking some time afterward to kind of open up space for, how did I do? And that, did that not resonate with you? And kind of putting your feelings aside about the situation to recognize your impact. I think that's a great practice because, of course, these are not always going to be easy conversations. It's a great point. I appreciate also this comment from earlier about personality assessments can also be a part of the prior strategies around self-awareness and exploration. No tool is perfect, but different tools can give you different insights into your tendencies and behaviors. Absolutely. Any other things that have been helpful, either you've done or experienced in check-ins with your staff? Having check-ins in a neutral space. That's a great point, Scott. I think we often default to like my staff is going to come to my office. Um, so either thinking about a neutral space where, you know, nobody kind of has a stake in what's going on, or even saying like, hey, I want to come to your space, supervisee. And actually having some open conversations about like what feels best for you can be really important. And of course, like you said, Scott, it depends on what the setup is of your campus and office, how feasible that is.
It makes me think too, Chelsea, adding on to that, like just this relationship building over efficiency, and how do we as supervisors really emphasize that relationship building? And are there times of year or certain staff meetings where like there is no agenda? We just come and show up and we have the conversation that needs to be had based on whatever is happening, right? Whatever anyone's feeling. And maybe it isn't even a formal staff meeting, but how are we building in opportunities to build that relationship and be a part of each other's day and work lives in a way that doesn't have an agenda attached to it? And how does that help then to transform those relationships and show that another way to show that relationship matters over efficiency?
Yeah, that's a great point. And it can start from the very beginning of a staff member's journey, right? Like those things can be talked about at the interview stage, at the onboarding stage. If all of your first interactions with a team member are here's what your job is and here's how to do it, that's again going to limit the amount of connection you can have with that person. Great points. Thank you all. So the last piece here is around advocacy for institutional change. And I'm reminded of a couple comments that happened earlier about dissonance between what higher ed institutions say they value and what actually happens. And what we talked about earlier when it comes to institutions saying, we value employee wellness. Here's a self-care workshop, or here's a free massage. Um, it really is a huge opportunity for the supervisors who have some inherent status and hierarchical power to advocate for tangible changes that actually can impact the day-to-day work and lives of our supervisees. So things like equitable compensation, a living wage, leave policies. Increasingly, I've heard more and more about the need to have flexible work agreements or work from home policies, especially for staff members who are parents or who are caregivers. This is all, these are the things I think that make a trauma informed institution function, and that can really have huge impacts on the quality of life of our team members. And I'm reminded there's an article by Anthem and Tuit who talk about, they use this metaphor of self-care as a sandbag. And they say, in the context of like a hurricane or a tropical storm, they say self-care is a sandbag. There are many minor storms it can withstand, but when what is needed is a levee, sandbags simply will not serve. So of course, there's time and space to say, like, take a long lunch, or leave for an hour, or do something to practice self-care. Absolutely. But what more and more researchers are talking about is the importance of community care, or us care. Different terms are used for it, which means that we're taking an active role in advocating to shift some of the systems that are negatively impacting our team members. I appreciate this comment as well, about the importance of kind of using tools for yourself to remember what you checked in about. For those of us who are supervising really large teams, or I know there have been times where I've supervised like a student staff of like 12 people, and it can be sometimes kind of hard when you have many other things in your brain to remember things. So kind of taking steps for yourself to like make a quick note afterward, or having some tool to help you follow up and check in about that stuff, can also be something super helpful in building relationships. So thank you for that. Are there other ways that you all think supervisors could be advocating for institutional change, or maybe other things aside from what I mentioned that would be useful for supervisors to think about?
Made me think, Chelsea, in kind of what our role is as supervisors to then advance forward compensation institutional changes, right? It's one thing, and you mentioned like, oh, take a longer lunch or make sure you do those things. I feel like often that's something that's right within my control as a supervisor and doesn't really ever require me to get additional approval or talk to anyone who's higher than me in kind of the hierarchy of leadership. But how are we then, and I think someone mentioned earlier, like advocating for our employees of like, okay, have we looked at our employee manual? Can we, organizationally make this change so that it isn't just a continual struggle for employees, no matter where they are within the system of a university or an organization, but how do we really take on that active piece, given what we see and what we hear as supervisors?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great point. And I think it can be very easy to feel kind of disempowered
Hmm.
in an institution, right? Especially for folks who are kind of at like a mid-level management role, like a director of an office. Those can be really tricky positions where you feel like you see a lot of things that need to change. You don't have a lot of power to change them. But adding your voice to a chorus of other folks who are asking for things can actually help to shift policies. I saw Andy also mentioned professional development funds as being a great opportunity to advocate for folks, and not just to give it when asked, but actually to sort of encourage it, or to say, hey, I think you'd be great at this opportunity. It's a great point. And then Scott mentioned linking to other institutional efforts. I believe, Scott, you can elaborate, but I think you mean linking different expansions and policies and practices to strategic planning efforts. Yeah. So advocating for more comprehensive family leave practices impacts queer parents, but also impacts many other people. Yeah, absolutely. A great point. So I hope that some of this resonated with you. I encourage you to think about, there was a lot of information. Maybe consider what's one takeaway, what's one thing that you want to do in your own supervisory practice. Maybe it's you want to read more about being trauma informed or being identity conscious. Maybe you want to use one of the tools or strategies we just talked about. But think about one thing that you'd like to do differently. I would recommend all three of these books as great starting points if this is a new conversation for you. So the two on either side are relatively new. They both came out in 2019, and they were not around when I was first doing some of this research. And actually, one of the co-editors in this one, Rob Brown, is another leadership co-lead. But these are wonderful texts that give really tangible, practical strategies for being inclusive and identity conscious in supervision. This middle text is a little bit different. These other two don't talk as much about trauma or the emotional impact of our work. But this text, even though it's not specific to higher ed, trauma stewardship is a great starting point for understanding the empathic weight of helping or healing others, and also has some great practical strategies that you could implement with your team for managing that impact. I also wanted to give a quick plug. So I mentioned I'm finishing up my dissertation work right now, and one of the things that my co-researchers and I are in the process of creating is actually a project that's going to include a website and some other resources on higher education supervision. May include things like an ongoing accountability space for folks who want to have some of those group connections and supervision. So that'll be coming out later this spring. And I am going to put in the chat right now a link to a Google form that you can fill out if you'd like. And I intentionally decided not to put like a bunch of citations on these slides because I felt like it would just be kind of cluttered and not helpful. But if you want any of the resources we talked about, if you want citations, if you want a copy of the slides, if you want a copy of book chapters or articles that I've written, there's room in that form to check that off. I'd be so happy to send it to you. And if you're watching this after the fact and you can't see the Google form link, you can also send me an email at the email that's up on the screen. I'm happy to send that your way too. And then there's also something on the Google form where you can check off if you want to be informed about the higher education supervision resources that'll be coming out later this spring. So that's all that I've got. I know that Kristen has a couple of parting comments for you all. But again, I've really appreciated your comments in the chat, and I know there's a lot of great wisdom here. Do folks have additional comments or questions or topics for conversation that you'd like to talk about before we wrap up today? Cool. Okay, great. Well, thank you all for having me and listening. Please do complete the Google form or reach out if I can provide you anything else, I'd be super happy to.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Chelsea. This was such a great and informative and thought-provoking conversation. I know it just as everyone's expressing their gratitude, I know I also have some of that as well, and took lots of notes to just think about. It's one of those topics that, regardless of where you are in your career, it's something you can always learn more about and continue to grow in, right? The supervisor I was 5 years ago is different than this, hopefully, than the supervisor I am now. And hopefully that's a positive thing, and not that I've taken and done, bad worse things than maybe what I did previously. But how do we learn from that? And how do we invest that in ourselves as supervisors? And it also made me think too of how do we pass this on generationally to others who come after us in higher education and other professionals, because we know it's not part of the training that you get. So how do you then make this part of the what you do with your staff so that you can train them to be supervisors moving on, because that is their path for some of them as well. So thank you for that. Thank you for that. Well, with that, if you can switch, Chelsea, I'm gonna show up a couple of our slides as well, just as we wrap up. Thank you. So just as we wrap up, we already did this one. There you go. So a couple of just announcements from leadership. If you're a leadershiper and you're like, it's really cool, and I would like some leadership gear to remind me of some leadership principles, you can scan this QR code, and you too. I don't have my hoodie on today. I wore it yesterday. It was such a cute hoodie, but there are things on there to help you remember your leadership experience and share those messages with others. If you have not been involved in leadership and you're looking to be involved, we are accepting applications for cluster facilitators for our upcoming national session of the Leadership Institute happening this summer, one in Massachusetts and one in Illinois. So scan that for more information. And join us tomorrow for more virtual conversations. So we'll be gathering again tomorrow, same time, different link, but we'll be gathering tomorrow to continue to learn about. We'll spend time with Katie Selby and talking about kind of careers and what does that look like for us as we shape our career, and how do we continue forward with that? And I think with that is all that I have. So thank you all for joining. If you do have anything, we'll have a couple of minutes left. If anyone has other questions, Chelsea and I will stay around for a few minutes, but thank you very much for your time this afternoon, and have a great week.